Good morning to the YouTube listening audience, and good morning again to the folks of you who are in the auditorium and to those of you who are listening on live stream. Reverend Jack Abel here, Senior Director of Spiritual Care at Caron Treatment Centers. I think it's the 23rd of May, 2021. I think it's actually Pentecost Sunday, so for those of you who are into the Christian liturgical calendar, one would be praying that I would get zapped with the Holy Spirit and do my Blues Brothers catapult up the center of the auditorium, but we'll just have to wait and see. I have a subject matter that I want to speak to you about and some thoughts about it that have been stewing in my bizarrely disorganized brain over the course of the week. The subject matter comes from a calendar that rotates through about every 4 months. And so by the time I reach the topic again, I'm in a fresh place with it, which is interesting and keeps it fresh for me. So we're back at the topic of surrender. Surrender is a perennial theme in addiction recovery. And if you hang around a place like Caron or other treatment centers, you will hear clinicians and people in recovery talk about surrender as if it's as well defined as an apple or a chair or something. Although obviously apples are computers and chairs come in many forms. But there's something about this topic that is a lot more elusive than the well-defined word would suggest. And one of the reasons why I think it becomes such a topic of conversation as I've thought about it this week is that actually I think it's annoying for the clinician. Because, I will just speak for myself, I have worked in my work with you as patients to try to figure out how to be skillful in helping you inch towards change. But every once in a while, and I say that as if it's infrequent, although that's actually not true. And when you study the phenomenon more broadly, what you find out is that really quite often, people leap into change. Like, instead of inching towards change, all of a sudden, it's as if the apple becomes an orange, or the watershed moment happens, and instead of the incremental tug of war, there is this dramatic movement into what we call like surrendered recovery. A clinician would describe it as surrendered recovery. And I actually have on my desk a magic wand, and I use it as an illustration tool. It's not that it's got any potency, but I will say very often I've picked it up and actually touched the head of a patient because I've tried to make the point that what I am actually praying, even though I'm working on the incremental, I'm kind of praying for the woo! You know, like I want that thing to happen, and it's a little elusive and mysterious, and it's what we're talking about. So, when AA talks about surrender, it associates it often with the third of AA's 12 steps. There was a clinician here years ago who had a method. I'll talk about that maybe if I remember to later in the sermon, but there are people who think that there are ways to facilitate surrender. I'm actually a little suspicious of that because I don't know a magic formula to get you into the place I'm talking about. But one thing I could say, which might be helpful for you if you're wondering what the heck I am talking about, is that in trying to discuss this with patients, I have had many patients tell me, well, I have surrendered because I'm here. And I want to say that my favorite way of explaining that used to be, I've done a whole message about this, a chess illustration, that's like sacrificing a piece on the chessboard. It does not mean you have surrendered, because you came to treatment is not what I'm talking about. Not because somebody squeezed you or you acquiesced or you woke up one morning and you're like, I can't do this anymore, I'm going to go to get care. That has the flavor of a bit of surrender, but it is not the res tantum, that's a Latin expression for the very thing, the like mysterious entity that is the subject of our discussion. Not only is this mysterious thing that I want to talk about, and it's hard to talk about, a thing in Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous and Recovery Dharma and SMART and just in the journey of struggle with people with use disorders, gambling, shopping, sex, internet gaming, all that stuff. It also is a perennial theme in wisdom traditions. So my stole has on it the symbols of many of the world's major traditions that are ancient forms of wisdom. And in Christianity, surrender is often associated, you're going to hear gospel readings about Jesus and the sacrifice of the cross as the ultimate surrender on our behalf. But that's not the only tradition that has this notion, and you can find it in Judaism and Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism. And often in the wisdom traditions, which is the helpful clue as you're trying to understand it and figure out whether you're eligible and how to get to this magic place I'm talking about. One of the things that it becomes paired with in the wisdom traditions is the theme of new birth. So surrender is like dying to the old, and then the new birth is the journey that follows. So there's an old me that has to kind of go away, or an old habit, or an old aspect of me. It's not like I'm not the guy I was as a child. I certainly am in some ways. But the person I so do not resemble is the person in my early 20s, who was, this is just speaking for me, I was so self-absorbed, not that any of you are that way, and I honestly thought I was a good guy and that I wasn't a liar. I mean, I told people I was an honest person while I was lying to them even about that. It's just astonishing to me how limited my insight was into the way the sickness had contaminated my capacity to see my own lack of integrity. And I know today the world saw me as self-centered. I know I was self-centered in this bizarre way, but it wasn't because I wanted to be self-centered. I actually thought of myself as kind of a good guy. It just wasn't experienced that way. And so for years I've chased the descriptor arrogant, and I still exhibit those characteristics. I'm very aware of it. You're welcome to put it on your exit surveys, but join the crowd. And I'm trying to attend to that, and because I realize that really, I don't like it when people come across that way. And I've slid off of my outline, but I was talking about wisdom traditions and this phenomenon of new birth. And the idea that in surrender, because surrender sounds awful, especially to our first responders. Our first responders think dude, and our Marines, I've never surrendered. Don't even tell me that word. I'm headed out the other door, But surrender is a form of victory, paradoxically. Another one of my illustrations I used to use, I'll use it again. I went to a college in 1979. The college had been in existence for 18 years, 79, 61. It started in 1961. It's still in existence. It's about to celebrate its 50-year thing in October. It's called Hampshire College, weird school in Massachusetts. And when I was admitted to Hampshire in 1979 and went to the college bookstore, I wanted to get swag, and so there was football jerseys there, and the football jersey looked like every other college's football jersey, except Hampshire College, undefeated since 1961. No team. Get it? It's funny, right? So it's in that sense that surrender is victory, not defeat. Because every time I get on the playing field with alcohol, I lose. And it is in this bizarre capitulation that I actually find death to that and a new beginning. So the third thing I thought that might be helpful to talk about in terms of the idea of surrender before we get to the rest of the service and you all can share and pray and see where this takes us, is that as a mathematician and a theologian, one of the things I have seen is that deep thinkers often find it helpful when you're trying to get at something that's a little elusive, is to ask the question, what is this opposite? Right? So if you can't really nail it down, like what is it, how do you know when you're not? And that, I think, is very helpful. Because I have, in previous years, tried to say that to me there's almost like it's not an olfactory thing, this is a metaphor, but there's almost like a scent of surrender. There's a taste and a feel that I get when I'm sitting with you and you tell me about where you are and what you're doing here and what your next moves are. And I will almost in 10 seconds make an internal assessment that's very hard for me to shift in or out of, where I'm like either, yep, surrender's there, or no, it's not. And the classic recovery language of not surrender, which is illuminating, even if you're not going to use AA, it's good to learn from AA because AA works for a lot of people and it has things to teach us. In Alcoholics Anonymous, not surrender is described with the adjectival phrase, white knuckling. And a humorous thought in the same category was, I remember years ago when I was first in my early recovery, I remember hearing somebody in the meeting say, I never let go of anything that didn't have claw marks in it. So, if you are feeling, in some respect, when you engage with either the material of your treatment work, or with the process with your treatment team, or with the dialogue with those who are outside your work, your family, your school, your job, like whatever that is, and you are in struggle mode, then that is not what surrender looks like. It's a helpful clue that you're not in this peculiar state. And watch for the white knuckles, because when you squeeze like that, if you just do that, you can see my knuckles go white right away. It's a clench. And if you feel the tightness of the jaw, or you're like, how that back, and you have the neck ache or the stress headaches or whatever like that, then those are little tells that you might not be in surrender. You're like, I have a family session on Tuesday. You might not be in surrender. I'm going to get my recommendation on Wednesday. You might not be in surrender. They told me that I need X, Y, Z. You might not be in surrender. And a couple of things to say. One is, first of all, I hope I could tell you, surrender is an attractive option. I really do, and that makes it imply that you could just flip yourself into it. I don't know, there's a bit of a mystery to it. So I was reading this week a book by one of my clinical heroes, a fellow whose name is William Miller. And Bill Miller wrote a book 25 or 30 years ago called Motivational Interviewing with another guy. I don't know if any of you ever heard of motivational interviewing. Smart Recovery uses it as one of its core methods. We train our clinicians in motivational interviewing. You have been being treated with motivational interviewing, even though you probably don't know it. Because we're, as Caron, I say we, Caron has deeply embraced the work of Bill Miller and his insights, which are tremendously important. He's a brilliant, wonderful guy. And I've had a chance of hearing him speak. I was just a couple weeks ago on a webinar, and that's why I ended up reading his second book. His second book is titled Quantum Change. And motivational interviewing is all about helping people like me help people inch towards recovery. But the book Quantum Change is about this opposite. It's the fact that Bill says, even though I spend my whole life training people how to inch towards recovery, every once in a while I see people just almost jump into it. And it's a bit baffling. It's like, wow, did they get zapped by the Holy Spirit, or did they, whatever. So in Bill Miller's book, Quantum Change, he examines a bunch of really good questions about, and he does a whole series of interviews of people who have testimony to these profound, positive, benevolent, persisting, transformational experiences in their lives. And it's kind of a cool project, right? It's interesting. And I have not finished the book, but I'm already I can't wait to go back and read more of it. And here's a couple of pieces of data from their research. One is that religion can be a piece of how people interpret quantum change, but it's not really the same thing. it's a lens through which people talk about that. So they might talk about how they experienced this state change from one moment and aspect of their life to another moment and aspect of their life through the activity of a religious framework and an entity or sets of powers or methods that go with it. But that's because that's how they interpret life in the world in general anyway. So there's some overlap for people with religiosity and quantum transformation, which is a new way of talking about when I'm talking about surrender, using Bill Miller's definition of it, but it's not exactly the same. Here's another interesting fact. He said of all the stories that they looked at, the single most common predecessor behavior, more than half, but by no means 80 or 90%, but the single most common predecessor behavior was prayer. So people who were telling the stories about, hey, I once was this way and then I became that way, and you know, a week before I was in a foxhole moment and I asked a higher power I didn't even believe in, or a week before I was, you know, in this situation and I finally asked for help, or those kinds of things. And so even though it's not uniform and it doesn't always work, it would be a tool that would be available to you. It's highly recommended. It's on the 11th of the 12 steps, and it's an option. You could ask for a power you don't even know if you believe in to help you, and it might be that in the asking, something internal in the tectonics of this peculiar phenomenon is helped and facilitated. When I was talking about methods, there used to be a guy here who was a clinician, great guy, peculiar and controversial, but his thing was he would have a group, and everybody in the group, and he'd put a chair in the middle of the group, and he'd have the AA Big Book, and he'd open it to the third step prayer, which you're going to hear somebody read in a little bit. And he would have the patient kneel in front of the chair and read the third step prayer of the Big Book, as if, like me with the magic wand, as if that was going to like induce the transformation. It was very emotional for many, many patients. I had many patients tell me that they had had that experience, and it was profound. And I had many patients who told me, like, you know, I'm not even doing it, or it pissed them off, or, you know, like, it's not a magic bullet. It does not necessarily effectively work in all circumstances. But it perhaps is indicative. A couple of weeks ago I talked about Carl Jung and Bill Wilson and the correspondence between them, and Carl Jung reflected that the patient that he couldn't help might want to put himself around people who had had spiritual experiences. So that's general advice. Like, get around people who have been zapped, and who knows, it might be contagious. Just like they say, if you hang around the barbershop, you're going to get your hair cut, and if you hang around the bar, you're likely to drink. If you hang around recovering people, you might catch it. So ask for it, hang around it, notice when you're not in it. Like, watch for that. Watch for the claws. And that's all I really know to say, except also I feel like I would not be doing my job if I didn't invite it. I believe that there is some yes in the end that you must make. You have to decide to accept the gift of recovery. And I don't know that we say that enough. But I deeply believe that from the people I've seen. And that's one of the things in the Bill Miller book. He says when they started their research project, they thought, oh, this is an infrequent thing. It's actually super frequent. People change all the time. They change from Scrooge, like the classic Scrooge story. There are all kinds of Scrooge stories, you know. And almost every Christmas movie is a transformational thing. And people make changes all the time, but they have to agree to be changed, and that is in your control. So my prayer and hope and intention for the service today was that you would feel a challenge and invitation. Because I will be honest with you and tell you, by far the majority of our patients on arrival are not surrendered. By far, most of you are not. And many of you, by the time you leave, weirdly, many of you are, but many of you are not. Many of you, by the time you leave, are still not. You're still in negotiation phase. You might have a ceasefire, to use the contemporary Middle Eastern dynamic, but the war is not over. And how long are you going to fight might be partly up to you. So, one last thing to say, and then I will shut up. And I didn't expect to say this, but it's on my heart to say it. When I have had the privilege of being on treatment teams and we work with individual patients, one of the ways that not surrender shows itself is in distrust of us. You think we're out for the money. You think we don't care. You think it's just it's just a no, and we're just trying to crank the engine, and especially if we're referring you to continuing care within the Caron umbrella, that would raise my suspicions. But that suspicion is a deep tell for me that you haven't surrendered, because it's easy for me to say it, I'm biased. I have to tell you, I think the people who come to work here, by the great majority, come here to help you. And that we cry when you die. And we hurt when you leave in fury. And we grieve when you interpret our best efforts as manipulation. So if that's the spin you're making on this, that's on you. It's not on us. Let's celebrate surrender today as victory rather than defeat. Thank you. Thank you.